Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Horowitz, the faculty director here at Perry Worldhouse. For those of you that have not been here before, Worldhouse is the University of Pennsylvania's hub for global engagement, where we build bridges between academia and the policy world. Our work is structured around four themes: democracy, security, climate change, and human rights and global justice. We have an amazing event today, and to introduce it, I want to introduce someone that has done an incredible amount for Penn's global mission and helped shape Worldhouse into what it is today. If you like what you see at Worldhouse, give him the credit. If you don't like it, blame me. Dr. Zack is the Vice Provost for Global Initiatives, the co-director of the Healthcare Transformation Initiative Institute, and the Diane V.S. Levy and Robert M. Levy University Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He's an oncologist and a world leader in health policy and bioethics, and a special advisor to the Director General of the World Health Organization. He's also a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is a transformational leader that was here at the outset of Worldhouse and helped envision the notion of Worldhouse as a hub for global policy engagement on campus. And without any further ado, I'd like to invite him to come on stage.
It was an excessively long introduction to a guy who is irrelevant to the moment. Welcome, everyone, to Perry Worldhouse. We at Perry Worldhouse, as you know, are committed to democratic values and, in particular, robust and challenging discussions, both on campus and around the world. To this end, we've made democracy one of our four pillars that we're pursuing over the next few years. It was our newest pillar, launched in 2024. We all know, and I think part of the reason everyone's here is because there has been a systematic and really worldwide assault on democracy and backsliding from democracy to autocratic countries throughout Europe, the United States, South America, and other places. But we also know that, or we're here because we don't think the situation is hopeless, that there are things we can do in the moment where we can reverse things. And we've seen recently in many places where the populace is taking things into their own hands. It's true in Africa, Senegal being a very particular example. It's true in Europe, where Poland threw off many years of a more repressive, autocratic, anti-democratic regime, and Brazil, where we've seen prosecution of autocrat. Today, I think we're going to take a very important and interesting perspective on how do you revive democracy? How do you take it back, as it were, from autocrats? And what can we learn from other countries that might be relevant in this moment here, but also in other countries? We have a wonderful panel of three individuals. Zack Beauchamp, he's a Perry Worldhouse Distinguished Visiting Fellow, Senior Correspondent for Vox, where he covers democracy in the United States and around the world. And I just might add parenthetically, his father and I were colleagues. He's a son of a bioethicist, so we're colleagues. So I have a very nice place in my heart for him. Carolina Jiménez Sandoval is a Perry Worldhouse Distinguished Visiting Fellow as well, and the president of the Washington Office on Latin America. She focuses extensive research on and advocacy work on human rights issues, gender and racial justice, democracy, and rule of law. And Dahlia Scheindlin is a leading public opinion expert, international political strategist based in Tel Aviv, Israel. Over the last 2 decades, she's advised 9 campaigns in Israel, and she's consulted on political strategy in 15 other countries around the world. A lot of her surveys and political analysis focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. How couldn't? peace negotiations, democracy, human rights. I am very proud to say she's the inaugural Penn Global Middle East Distinguished Visiting Professors. After October 7th, we launched a program to bring individuals from the Middle East, both on the Israeli side and the Arab side, to Penn to teach courses, engage with our faculty, engage with our students, to give people insights, as it were, from where the events were happening. This initiative was generously supported by a gift from Judy and Stuart Colton. Stuart graduated in the early 1960s from Penn. And it does aim for this sort of cross-cultural understanding and dialogue. Dahlia has taught at Penn in the political science department on comparative perspectives on democracy in Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East. And we have 3 other scholars from Israel and other parts, Palestine and other parts in the Middle East coming over the next 3 semesters. So with that, that's our panel, and they will be interviewed by David Dreilinger, who's the program manager of our democracy pillar. He has come to Penn after many years as a foreign service officer with the State Department and has really energized our democracy and even more broadly, our global activities here at Perry World House. So with that introduction, thank you for coming, and I welcome the panel and David.
Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. I'm extremely excited for this conversation. At this panel, we have some truly global expertise, and we're here to talk not just about what's wrong with democracy in the world, but also what's going right. We know there are a number of democracies on every continent that are taking steps backwards. Aspiring authoritarians seek to replace liberal democratic systems with regimes that curtail freedoms, that persecute opponents, that scapegoat the vulnerable, that concentrate power in their own hands. But in some places, these would-be autocrats are failing or could still fail. People and institutions have pushback, and we're here to talk about why that pushback worked, what we can learn, and what democracy defenders today, both at home and overseas, should be thinking about. So to begin, I want to turn to each panelist and ask, what is democratic resilience and what should we be focusing on? Dahlia?
Thank you. Okay, good. Thank you. Well, I think that, from the experience that I've been living, I think all of us have been living in Israel, I should say Israel and Palestine over the last number of years, there's been such an assault on democratic institutions, but one of the big takeaways for me is that while parts of the population were shocked, I think that they were shocked partly because there was not a firm or deep enough grounding in understanding the vulnerabilities in that system to begin with. And so, something that we probably all know who think about these things is that don't ever take it for granted, but also you need to know your system really deeply and what the flaws, missing pieces, missing foundations and vulnerabilities might be, which I think in the Israeli case has been underestimated. And, the evidence of that is that so much of the literature on democratic erosion and illiberal trends in democracy in the 1990s, but particularly in the 2000s, simply didn't touch Israel at all. They just didn't even include Israel. And I think that was sort of, somewhere between a blind spot and evolving historic circumstances, but also, a kind of unwillingness to look at it beyond a bit of a mythology. So that was part of it. What has resilience meant? To my mind, if I had to zoom out and say what might be applicable to other cases, it's the idea that, if the public should elect leaders who are, illiberal and possibly even despotic, the best way to deal with them is to democratically elect a different leader and throw them out of office. But to do that, there's no guarantee about how, and I think that the main, ways try to work towards that is extensive civil society mobilization, because the party, you can't, in Israel, we have a possibility of parliament, we have a parliamentary system, so we have the possibility of early elections. Presidential systems would make it harder. But to get to those early elections, still, there's no real legal mechanism for the public to do that. And so it still can only happen from within the political system. And so civil society has an incredible role to play in the meantime, because they can't force elections. Nobody can really force elections. And so the first aim is the political change. The second aim, though, or the means and the aim, is to have civil society mobilized. And that's something that looks very exciting, starting from early 2023 in Israel, but was a very, very long time coming. And the reason it was a long time coming is because the lack of attention to the issue, even as it was heating up over the years. But once civil society is mobilized, I think resilience means particularly trying to stave off the worst of the assault, right? Really trying to push back on every single attempted legislation that would undercut judicial independence or chip away at civil society, pressure on NGOs, pressure on the media, attempts to, again, re-engineer, for example, the Judicial Appointment Committee. All of these things were met with widespread resistance from civil society in order to stop or slow the particular assault. So that's the second layer of it, is trying to protect, or prevent as much damage as possible in real time. And I would say the third piece of it is mobilizing even when it feels politically not very effective, because again, you can't actually collapse a government just from the streets, even though we have examples of that in the past. I should just say, there have been examples of major public, outpourings of pressure that did lead to political collapse. But for that, you need a responsive government. And the moment you're in democratic decline, you're no longer talking about a government that feels accountability to the public. So all of that civil mobilization can feel ineffective, especially when the policies they're trying to protest, continue to move ahead. And so the third layer of it, I would say, is mobilizing for the sake of mobilizing. And why do I think that's important? Because when people see that they're not alone in pushing back against the government, and when they see the numbers, the energy, just knowing that there's a community out there doing this, in a way, is kind of holds it. It's like keeping the energy going until there is the opportunity for an election in order to, in which political change might come around. Aim being political change, in the meantime mobilizing to try to slow or stop the actual assault, and creating that community to generate the momentum that can hopefully lead to political change when there are elections. Let's say that's my introduction.
So political scientists use these overly complex terms like onset resilience and breakdown resilience to describe different kinds of democratic resilience. I'm a journalist, so I don't have to do that, and you're an audience that doesn't need to. Also, we were introduced by a doctor, so I'm going to go with a medical metaphor here. And I think you can think about this a little bit like an illness, right? If democracy is a body, and normally it's well-functioning and healthy, well, sometimes bodies get sick, right? And there's two ways to think about that. One is sometimes some people get sick less. Maybe their body is healthier in an underlying fashion, right? That means they're less likely to contract a particular kind of disease. And then some people bounce back better, or less likely, they have fewer morbidities, right? Comorbidities. They're less likely to die if they get sick or suffer severe negative consequences. So those are sort of the two broad tranches, right? The onset and breakdown resilience in the political science jargon that we talk about when we talk about democratic backsliding and resilience. But I want to focus on breakdown resilience, or the once you get sick, do you have the antibody response that you want in order to deal with it type question. And the reason I want to focus on that is because right now we are in a sort of global pandemic of democratic decline, right? It really is the case that in countries across the world, for all sorts of different reasons, and there's some very interesting commonalities between these countries, and my book is about that, about some of those commonalities. But right now we're talking about the commonalities of resistance, and that's harder to discuss. It's harder to discuss because we're still in, again, I'm going to just keep torturing these metaphors, in the early stages of the global pandemic, right? Democratic backsliding is a new thing in the way we understand it. In the past, I mean, there weren't very many democracies prior to 1945. There were very few globally, about 12, if I can recall correctly, at the end that survived, made it through the end of the Second World War. And there were over 100 by the year 2000. And so most of the academic scholarship and the journalism surrounding this was about the amazing miracle of democracy's expansion and democratization and how you go from an authoritarian state to a democracy. The concept of a democracy backsliding is a 21st century thing. There are very, very few cases of it happening in the way that it's happening now, which is a country that looked like a stable democracy, let's say the United States hypothetically, becoming something less of a democracy and increasingly maybe even devolving into an authoritarian state entirely. The paradigmatic case here is modern Hungary, which was considered widely to be one of the great success stories of the post-communist transition. And then within about 20 years, roughly, a little bit more than that, more like 25, of the end of communism, it had become a fully authoritarian state again. So what we're trying to discuss when we talk about democratic resilience in this context is what do you do about this peculiar modern phenomenon of democratic decline and democratic backsliding? How do you respond to it? And what tactics can be used to arrest it once it starts? Because I think it's a lot easier to talk about prophylaxis, and it's a lot harder to talk about, okay, we have a government, an incumbent government that's intent on bringing down democracy. How do you stop them? And we can get into some of the specifics in a second. But I just wanted to sort of lay the broad terrain here, not only to be conceptually clear on what we're discussing, but also to foreground the limitations of what we know, because this is all so new, and we're working with a very limited and very particular set of cases that can resist generalization in a lot of ways.
Hola. Hello. Very happy to be here. When you hear September 11, or 9/11, you will say in the US, of course, us being in the US, you will of course think of a horrible date, and you will think of New York, and you will think of the Twin Towers, and you will think of the worst, terrorist act that the US has ever been a victim of. But if you are Latin American, you will think of Santiago de Chile, and you will think of airplanes bombing the presidential palace. And you will think of a coup d'etat that changed the history of Latin America, because Augusto Pinochet overthrew a popularly elected leader and installed one of the worst dictatorships that we, lived through. But it wasn't just Chile. It was Chile, Uruguay, Argentina. There was one in Brazil before. There was a dictatorship in Bolivia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we went through many dictatorships, and the way they came to power was usually that way, military coups. Now you fast forward 50 years, and we rarely see coup d'etats this year. For the most part, we're not different from many other countries. Our democracies die slowly, die gradually, die through elections, through within. And that is why we are also discussing democratic resilience, because we understand that the political systems that we have so hard tried to build, meaning democratic political systems, need to resist the pressure, need to resist the threats. And that's why it's become so important to understand how to survive this erosion and how to learn from each other and from the lessons that we went through in the past, how they can be applied now in this present time. So I think we're going to discuss what this new era of democratic erosion means. But I do want all of you to make sure that we understand that there is no way to understand this current moment without understanding the past, of course, if you are a Latin American. It's not that this is completely new. It may be new for other countries and other regions. But for us, many of the things that we see in a country like the US or in other regions is something that reminds us of experiences that are very painful and that are, incredibly alarming, but that we have dealt with in the past, that we have overcome, that are not inevitable, but that need to be addressed and that can be that can be reversed, and that's a really important message.
Great, thank you. Part of the idea of this event is to identify what might go into a democratic playbook. We know the authoritarian playbook. We know how autocrats, aspiring autocrats, move into a society and move into a system and try to change it in that process through democratic backsliding. And I think one of the things that's come out of all the responses is the speed at which this backsliding can happen. And often it happens kind of slowly. And it's kind of hard to identify what's actually happening and when you should be alarmed. How do you convince people that they should mobilize? How do you convince people that this is really an urgent situation? Have you seen examples where this has happened and things that we can learn from it? Start with Dahlia.
Now tortured medical metaphor. I mean, I think it goes back to the question about the past. If you're not getting the right diagnosis of the initial starting point of your democratic system or attempts at a democratic system, you're probably not going to be resilient, or you're certainly not going to be able to prevent attacks or assaults, because they will inevitably happen. But if you're not getting it right, how can you get the right treatment for it? So I feel like that is a starting point. And I think that my perspective, when you said that it's a new phenomenon, yeah, it is 21st century, I would say. So there's always been the reverse wave concept. But in the 21st century, we can distinguish two different kinds. One, I would say, is the erosion and backsliding of countries that were undergoing democratic transition, democratizing countries. And they didn't really have a very strong tradition of democracy. Their institutions were sort of new. Transitions take decades. And naturally, they were vulnerable to predatory politicians. But what we're seeing now, let's say for the last 15 years, is democratic erosion in established democracies. But now, even as I say that, right, and that's what makes surprises us all. How could it be that the U.S. is undergoing this kind of thing? But it makes me wonder if the diagnosis was right. I mean, was American democracy really that strong for that long, right? I mean, how many, even following the Civil War and the 14th Amendment, we had to get to the 1960s to have, full Voting Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. And so it depends on when you start counting that a country is actually a strong democracy in order to be able to point out where the vulnerabilities may lie. I can say that the experience in Israel was not very good. There was a lot of long, slow, frog boiling lead up time, and there were various turning points along the way. Again, my argument would be that we should have seen, the vulnerabilities much earlier, right? When you incorporate undemocratic practice throughout the entire history of your country, what you consider to be democracy has a problem, whether it's the military government that ruled over Israel's own citizens, about 15% of them for the first 20 years, or occupation practices for the next 57 years. If that's what you think of as democracy, you have a problem. And so there have been people speaking out against that, raising the alarm for decades, but they were considered, lefty radicals. Then in more modern times, we had the beginnings of a chipping away, of a kind of laying the groundwork to undermine both judicial authority and judicial independence, not in 2023. This started in roughly the late 2000s, and much more significantly in a more politicized way from about 2009-10 onwards. And then you had people beyond the lefty peaceniks saying, this is a real assault on our democracy, we should all be alarmed. And they were mostly ignored or mocked as alarmists because people had, more urgent things to think about. And I think finally, when the groundwork had been built to legitimize the assault on democratic institutions and values, and by the way, the assault on the judiciary was only ever a means to an end, and the end was to enact illiberal policies and, hopefully diminish the power of the gatekeepers. And by the time January 2023 came around and the government announced this very, very elaborate package of laws and policies designed to eviscerate judicial independence, all of a sudden, much of the population who really hadn't been paying attention, or who had said, oh, those democracy people, they're just being alarmists and we have more important things to worry about, suddenly felt like this was threatening their personal situation. I think that mainstream Israeli society suddenly said, oh, we've made progress, for example, on things like gender equality over the years, and that's going to be threatened. We've made progress on all sorts of things that affect, let's face it, mainstream society. that are going to be under threat right now, whether it's, even free market related stuff, or the high-tech industry thought that its freedom of, in general was going to be cramped, and they were saying things like, we need to have complete freedom of thought and expression in order to be creative, to the medical community who argued that you can't actually have a good medical system if your democracy is going to be too constrained. But a lot of the things, I'm skipping over why those are considered the outcome of a democratic system, but in Israel, all of those areas developed over the 70s, 80s, and 90s in a more robust way because of Israel's liberalization for its citizens during that time. So people felt like the progress that they had personally experienced and the kinds of, general, freedom in a way, to live with these kinds of social norms in society were going to be threatened. And I think that it's when people felt that, like, it would affect them personally that we saw masses suddenly snapping into action. It wasn't powerful enough when they could not see the direct impact on their own lives, and when they were told in an abstract way that, threats to the judicial institutions were somehow bad for human rights, but if it involved human rights of others, it really wasn't so front and center. I have to say that it's not a very lofty or noble lesson, but when people feel like it's going to affect them personally, they're much more likely to go out on the street.
Here we go. So Dahlia is picking up on a specific case of something that I've generally started calling the overtness or the legibility game. And here's why I think of it as a game, right? So start with the premise number one, that in a democracy, in a country that has at least a reasonably well-established democracy, a majority of citizens wish to continue living in a democracy. This is not just my random speculation, it's decently well borne out by polling data that suggests widespread support normatively, at least in the abstract, for democracy. So that means nobody wants to appear undemocratic. Yet, in any case of democratic breakdown, there is an agent, the incumbent government, that wants to destroy democracy. That's what they are trying to do. So if the people don't want them to do that, a majority of people in a democracy have the potential to put severe curbs or checks on that elite. And it's not just a majority, by the way, it's also a majority of the elite who's concerned about this. And the elite can play an even more important and immediate role in constraining their behavior in venues like courts, Congress, businesses, lobbying in places like that, all sorts of different elite actors. The military plays an important role in a lot of these cases. They can be motivated too, right? So the question is, how do you activate the sense of threat, what Dahlia was just describing, of personal, immediate interests being at stake in the decline of democracy? How do you get people to recognize that? Is it just their self-interest? Is it just saying that, well, if this process of democratic decline tangibly hurts my interests in one way or another? If you're a business, then if you're not having a reliable rules-based, rule of law type system, then, well, we can't really do business very well anymore. I don't think it's just that, right? I think there's also a normative component here. I think people care about democracy. They do because they care about the idea of living in a democratic system. It matters to them. And so that part of the thing, of the whole conflict, depends on convincing those people that the threat is real. Because it is very, very important. And these governments, like the current government in the United States, the Israeli government, the Hungarian government, go to great lengths to make a case that what they're doing is a version of democracy. Right? They won't say, nah, we're authoritarian now. What they'll say is, well, actually, we were elected. We have a mandate. We can do these changes. We can support them. Or, well, the court, in this case, is just getting in our way. Those are unelected lawyers. They don't have any role in determining policy. We should. We're the elected branches. Right? Various different versions of that argument. Or we represent the true people, as opposed to these inauthentic globalist elites who have been really pulling our strings behind the scenes, right? So so much of this depends on the ability to show that narrative, the democratic veneer of an authoritarian takeover, isn't working, right? That there's something wrong with that, to puncture that veneer. And there's no abstract set of rules as to how you do that. If I had that, I would already be writing my next book. Here's the rules. I'm hoping to maybe figure out some rules, but I'm not sure there is an abstract set of rules here. I think it just is a context-specific judgment that you have to make in each country as to how much normative sentiment matters and how, if it does matter, you can appeal to it.
Okay, I think we can establish the abstract um concepts, do not make people interested in many of the things we defend. And democracy can be one of them. Um, do people, do people relate to data? 1 out of 3 people, etc. 5 out of 6 people, etc. I don't know, but people will always remember our story, right? So the way we communicate our messages are as important as the substance itself. And I think I have to say this: I'm a human rights defender, not an academic, not a journalist. We are, I mean, really, really bad at communicating many of the messages that we have to give people. But if you have to think of the main communicators out there these days, think of them without any concern about their value system. I'm sure you are thinking of them. A lot of them are populist leaders, correct? Because they speak in plain language, they speak to the people, they promise things they cannot fulfill, but people buy their messages. So I think that's one important way to make people mobilize. People defend or people mobilize when they're with things that affect their daily life are on the line. And democracy is not necessarily something that affects their daily life unless you relate it to something that affects their daily life. So as an abstract concept, I'm not sure it always works. But when you talk about, members of my community being picked up by ICE, that probably works. The cost of living under threat, going out of hands, that probably works. But as an abstract concept, I think this is very hard. The second thing is that one problem when asking people to mobilize is that we don't have a plan B. Authoritarians are experts at manipulating grievances. They don't promise solutions. I mean, they don't promise how to solve problems, but they promise they will. So you don't have a job, I will give you jobs. The previous government didn't give you jobs, I will. They don't say how, but they promise they will. So people vote because they are unemployed. Now, do we have a plan to offer and make people mobilize against the authoritarian? We usually don't. So it's much easier for the populist to, to either stay in power or to reach power. I don't think you can make people mobilize if you don't have a clear plan B to outside or to be an alternative to a populist leader. And that's a major failure when it comes to asking people to mobilize. Just not having a plan B, not having an alternative narrative, just reacting to what the populist narrative is not enough. It doesn't make people mobilize, it doesn't inspire people to mobilize, and you also need a calling, you also need something that will excite people, but that will also convince people that there is an alternative to, to the narrative and to the promise that a populist has given you.
Great, thank you. I'll ask one more question and then look to the audience for some more questions for our panelists. But we have spent the day talking about this issue with a group of experts, and it's been a fascinating conversation. And I think different types of backsliding require different types of responses. It's one of the obvious conclusions. Sometimes you have to win elections. Sometimes you have to mobilize protest movements. But in all cases, you need to build coalitions. And it's proven to be extremely hard to build coalitions with people who are not naturally share your preferences and your ideological convictions. I know in Israel and Venezuela, though these movements have been imperfect, there's been some really impressive coalition building work. And I wondered if you could speak to examples you've seen of how to build coalitions, how to reframe narratives and conversations to build this pro-democracy resilience. And I'll start with Carolina, if that's all right.
That's a great question because my professor and my mentor back in my home country in Venezuela, Alfredo Barragán, used to say, las revoluciones son una coincidencia de rencores. Revolutions are a coincidence of resentments. And that's a strong phrase, but it's an interesting one. And when I think of coalitions, I think they are a coincidence of self-interests, and that is okay. You cannot expect that in a coalition, everybody will be there with shared values, but you can expect that they will be there because they share the same goal. And there's a big difference there. So to build a coalition, you need shared goals, not necessarily the same values. Now, that means that you need to go, you need to overcome grievances, differences, accept your diversity, but understand that that shared goal is what brings you together. I do think, as a human rights defender, I will always say there is an ethical limit to who is a member of your coalition. But I think we need to understand that we have reached, the need for cross-ideological movements to be together to defend democracy. And if I have to give an example, I think Guatemala is the best one that comes to mind in the recent history in Latin America, when Bernardo Arevalo was elected president. A coalition of, the status quo group in power formed by, ex-military, business interests, and very strong anti-democratic judicial actors did not want him to take office, of course. And it was very likely that he wasn't going to take office. And an organized coalition of indigenous groups, students, artists, but also a small part of the business sector got together, and for I don't know how long, 2 months, they protested peacefully. It was a peaceful protest. It was sustained. They had a very, very clear one shared goal to make sure that he came to office. They were from different cultural, economic, and ideological backgrounds, but they had one goal in common, and it was to make sure that Arevalo could take office. And Bernardo Arevalo is now in office. So I think that you can form coalitions even though you're different, but you need to make sure that your goal aligns despite your differences and especially your ideological diversity.
I think we have too blocky a notion of what a coalition is. And by blocky, I mean we think of it as one thing. A coalition is a united front of people who have agreed on, as you were saying, a particular objective, discrete objective they want to accomplish at one point in time. And I think that works that's right for certain things, right? Like if you're talking about an election in a multi-party democracy, right? Well, yeah, then you need a coalition, right? You need a united opposition coalition contesting the election, and you need to organize. That, I mean, the most recent example that everyone points to is Poland, right? The Polish opposition united all the opposition parties on a shared slate. They were going to lose otherwise, and it was the only way they managed to beat a pretty entrenched regime, right? And I think you need to look at similar cases when they're even more entrenched authoritarian regimes. But when you're in a democracy that's in the process of backsliding, or a two-party democracy, or one that is hypothetically both, you need to look at coalitions or think about them a little bit differently. Because it's not that you're going to get a grand alliance of people saying we're going to stop the regime in a lot of cases. It's that you might get these little individual narrow points where people are willing to do something that is useful. And while that may not be a shared united front, it may over time have the incremental and added united effect of blocking the government's attempt to overthrow the current constitutional order. What do I mean? I'll give you one very specific example. The case currently before the U.S. Supreme Court about tariffs. The U.S. Supreme Court has been probably Trump's number one enabler, aside from Congress, right, during the current attempts to weaken democracy. No one would call the Supreme Court a bulwark of the American state right now. I don't think that's reasonable. But if the Supreme Court rules against Trump in the tariffs cases, it actually is a really significant check on his ability to use power in order to consolidate his personalist control over the system. There are all sorts of reasons, we don't have enough time for me to get into them, why tariffs are a uniquely potent tool of democratic backsliding and presidential authority over them. But they're like this very weird policy that allows you to do all sorts of different things that can bring other elements of society online with your anti-democratic agenda if you want. So the Supreme Court, not part of the pro-democracy coalition, but a Supreme Court ruling against Trump on the tariffs issue could be seen as one contribution to an overall effort, a chess piece. It's an inexact metaphor, but a useful one, a chess piece that can be used by other elements of a more organized opposition in order to contest the broader effort to take down democracy. So that is a coalition of a kind, but it's not one that they're actually part of, right? It's like sort of contributions to United Front, even accidentally or for their own reasons, as the Supreme Court has.
So much in it. I wrote a lot down. I think the first thing about coalition building, I'll give you a little anecdote from Israel's example, which is that within about a week after the justice minister announced this series of laws that were designed to reduce judicial independence, there were huge demonstrations. And the first thing that happened was that there were two major demonstrations. This has gone down in the annals of one of the weirder things. There was a major demonstration in central Tel Aviv of people who were there to defend the judiciary and the Supreme Court and said, don't touch my democracy, and it brought people, including people who had just a month earlier had voted for parties of the coalition. And then there was another demonstration, also pretty big, of people who are traditional anti-occupation demonstrators. And there were pretty big numbers, right? They all kind of galvanized around this issue. And the two demonstrations all congregated in a similar area, and then they went marching separately. And there was a lot of confusion because people weren't sure which one they were supposed to go to or what they actually stood for. And very quickly, these activists realized this is an emergency situation. They cannot have split efforts. They can't fragment their efforts. And they're going to have to come together if they want the numbers and the sense of mass mobilization. And it involved ultimately a very painful compromise for one of those camps. Okay. And in this case, it turned out that it was the anti-occupation camp that had been on the street for years and decades, who said, okay, if it means not putting this issue front and center as the banner of why we should save democracy and why occupation is antithetical to democracy, we're going to have to do it. We're going to have to sort of, maybe not hide that, but just it won't be the central banner. We'll have to just join efforts with this broader, anti-judicial assault camp, because it brings in so many more people that we can't afford to alienate. So those compromises can be painful. They can involve giving up on very core principles in the hope that any progress towards saving democratic institutions will eventually lead to the larger aim that protest group represented. So that's one thing. They will involve painful compromises in that sense. I think the second major point is something that you alluded to before, or both of you alluded to, which is to try to bring it down to the issues that affect people's lives, rather than really trying to rally people in the name of democracy itself, which can be more abstract. In the case of Israel, it started with all these different groups who felt they were going to be personally affected, and then they were able to adopt the banner of democracy, save democracy. But what it meant was that there was a coalition of people through like both civil society and the private sector, right? We had the high-tech community, we had NGOs, we had the scientific community, the medical community, education, school principals, youth groups, gender groups, legal scholars who were out there on the streets, labor, right? We had the major labor union in Israel, the Federation of Labor Unions, who helped by calling general strike to try to protest some of the major things. And ultimately, they had to find a lowest common denominator. They don't agree on a lot, but they had to find that lowest common denominator of protect the democratic institutions, which, as you point out, if they're not running for office, they don't need much more of a platform than that, right? Save this, lowest common denominator. But that brings me to the next major coalition building issue, which is the political struggle. If you want to be in a multi-party system, if you want to be able to win elections, you have to be able to build a coalition, especially if it's fragmented like Israel's system. And that's where there are huge pitfalls. Israel's opposition managed to do that once in recent years, and that coalition fell apart quickly and might not be rebuilt. So if the political opposition can't build a coalition, there is no opposition. Okay, that's another major lesson. And I guess in the case of Israel in particular, all of this is happening in the shadow of ongoing military conflict and occupation, which is so antithetical to democracy that it's always going to be a rallying point for the forces, for the undemocratic forces who want to say, well, opposition is like being a traitor, opposition undermines, or even constraints on the executive power undermines security. All these legal experts are telling us we have to preserve human rights, but what you're really doing is empowering terror. It is a major, it's not just an exacerbating factor, it is a fundamental, undermining and preventing the growth of healthy democratic institutions that needs to be taken into account. And, I don't know how unique the situation is, but of course, among Israeli citizens, you have a minority who are, split in their identity. And that's the Palestinian or Arab citizens of Israel. And one of the big problems with coalition building is that even with the lowest common denominator on the Israeli civil society mobilization, they didn't really fully bring in and incorporate the Arab or Palestinian minority, partly because of the shadow of this conflict. And that is something that, just reinforces that when you have a military conflict going on, it's going to make all of this harder. And I say that as a warning to America, because America may very well soon be in a military conflict, as long as we're talking about Venezuela.
All right. Well, on that optimistic note, let's turn to the audience. Raise your hand, and we'll have a microphone brought over to you.
All right, you holding it? Cool. Lovely panel. Lovely to hear you guys. I guess I start off this question by a little tidbit. Born in Puerto Rico, moved to Philadelphia when I was 10. My first exposure to politics was CNN. I think it was James Carville who said, you can't in democracy, you can't say that the majority voted wrong, which I thought it was ridiculous because of, they're just people, right? They're flawed. But if that is one of the principles of democracy, and democracy is in decline, either you have to accept that democracy is in itself doing what democracies does, which is what happened with ancient Greece, right? Either that, or you have to sort of take accountability for those grievances that we speak about as to why they want to sort of go ahead and pick the authoritarian, those despotic figures. I guess my question is there a principle to democracy that can start building that coalition that you guys wish to do? And maybe one of those principles of democracy, right, capital D, is the promise that in a democracy, the unheard gets a chance to have an audience. So I guess with that, what do you think if that as an optimistic or a possible element toward democracy?
One of my mentors in political strategy. I will say that you can't argue with James Carville. If people voted for them, you can't say that people are wrong. Yeah, that raises a whole can of worms. I mean, the whole point about democracy, we've talked about this before. You can say, well, there's such a thing as just an electoral democracy, or there's such a thing as a liberal democracy where you have constraints on the power of the executive and constraints even on elected institutions. I don't really buy it. I think there's, if we're really talking about democracy, it has to mean a constitutional system where there are constraints on all institutions, all branches of government. They balance each other out with checks and balances. The state has to voluntarily constrain its power, or it's not a democracy. And to do that, you need civil liberties and civil society and independent judiciaries and, the kinds of things that Robert Dahl has long said, make elections actually competitive. So I don't think the people may not be wrong in their voting choice, but without those other things, it's just not a democracy anymore. That's one point. And the other thing is that I think that some of the research that there's a very good book called Democracy Erodes from the Top, which basically argues, and I've seen other literature on this, that says when people vote, they're not necessarily voting to destroy democracy because the candidates running aren't promising that. They're usually not running on saying, I'm going to undercut institutions and eviscerate, independence of the judiciary or, squeeze civil society. They're probably promising them jobs, lower prices, maybe not saying how they're going to do it. They're promising things that actually affect people's lives very directly. Somebody mentioned straight talk, plain talking populists. I think that you were saying they talk plain. I think there's more to it, right? Populists, yes, maybe have a straight talk style, but what they really do is also play off existential fears, us against them, internal enemies, elite versus the masses. And that's manipulation, right? So are people voting to vote out democracy? It's probably not what they have in mind.
This is really that part of it, I think, is just absolutely essential because that's not historically true, right? Like if the paradigmatic example that everyone had prior to the modern era of democratic collapse is Weimar Germany, right? And the Nazis weren't subtle about what they wanted, right? There was very clear articulation of an anti-democratic political program there and very specific contestation of core democratic ideals. Communist parties had similar approaches, right? Again, it was not we accept dictatorship of the proletariat. There was not a vision of electoral liberal democracy standing after, after the revolution. Modern democratic backsliding is different, right? It's about lying, not maybe intentionally, but I think probably mostly intentionally, most of the time. They're lying, right? They will say, we're here, we're following the rules, we're the true Democrats. So when you talk about democratic authorization, which is sort of the implicit theory of what Carville was saying, there's a disconnect that's happening right now. The people are not authorizing the outcomes that are happening from their vote choice because that's not what they were offered. In fact, they don't even know a lot of the time that these are the outcomes that are happening because the processes are so illegible to most ordinary people that they can't even follow that they've lost their democracy. Right? Hungary is a really good example, right? In the early 2010s, when democracy was first eroding in Hungary and Viktor Orban was standing up an authoritarian model, most of the changes that he overhauled the constitution, right? That part wasn't subtle. But the ways in which the constitution was overhauled were all very technocratic, very complicated. And unless you know the way that these different segments of constitutional change interacted with each other, right? Sometimes it was very complicated and the different laws were hidden in different portions of the legal code. You wouldn't have understood what had happened to make elections non-competitive until it was too late or unless you're a law professor. I've had Hungarian legislators say this to my face, like the EU, right? It's their job to watch these things. And the EU did not know what was happening. They didn't care to pay attention, or they didn't know to pay attention until after the refugee crisis and Viktor Orban became a problem for the rest of the European Union. Only then did they finally wake up to what had happened in one of their member states. So we're in a whole new ballgame, and we need to think of strategy and approaches, and even what the meaning of an election is in a different way when our politics is defined by dishonesty.
Just very briefly, I wanted to say one thing. Especially nowadays when we live in this viral society, it's important not to confuse popularity with democracy, right? Or with democratic leadership. Some of the most popular leaders in the world are also some of the most authoritarian leaders in the world right now. And that's incredibly scary, but it's political reality. And that makes our work incredibly difficult because their popularity also implies that to fight them is harder than to fight a non-popular authoritarian. So I think the more we move towards techno-authoritarianism, the more difficult this reality will be. I mean, they are popular and they stay popular even though they are authoritarians because they deliver things that democratic leaders could not deliver. And that's something that we need to come to terms with and understand to try to fix that. Why didn't democratic leadership didn't deliver, right? And I always say this, the power of social media has a very strong influence on how we view this type of leadership. Remember, Pinochet didn't have Twitter. Videla or Mussolini didn't have TikTok. I don't know, Hitler didn't have Instagram. We're different. This is a very different type of political communication as well.
Quick response to your other point about can we consider democracy something that includes the voice of the people who don't have enough of a voice or something like that? Is that a way of thinking about it? And I think the answer is absolutely yes, ideally. But I do think one of the biggest dangers is when there's a gap between what democracy is promising and what is actually happening. And that's when people have a sense of this whole thing is a sham. it's hypocritical. They're talking about democracy, but actually it's elites who are benefiting from it, and they're just talking about that in order to make us forget that we are marginalized economically or culturally or on some level. So that gap in promise, I mean, there's a reason why my own book on democracy, the history of democracy in Israel, the subtitle is Promise Unfulfilled, which is leading us to where we are now. So I think it's a real problem, but I also absolutely agree that nobody should ever diminish the grievances of people who are left out by the democratic system, whether it's economic marginalization, something the Democrats didn't really cope with enough in the last election, and to some extent, cultural marginalization or the sense of a threat to who you are and your lifestyle. It may be real, despite it also being manipulated. And those things need to be taken into account when you think about coalition building.
Great. We have time for one more question, and hopefully we can do maybe 1 minute answers. Sir.
It seems to me you're holding it for me. Well, thank you very much. That was everyone on both sides of the political spectrum almost think they're defending democracy. For example, the idea that Trump won in part because I'll get things done and I'll go right over the barriers to getting things done. That's to be able to get things done in response to the people who voted for you is a democratic notion. Franklin Roosevelt's enemies, opponents, defended their opposition to the New Deal in the name of democracy. And of course, one of the most famous incidents is when he tried to pack the Supreme Court. So there's what that suggests to me is that in addition to building coalitions by dealing with the everyday lives of people and what they care about, respecting that the other side also thinks they're defending democracy, and finding a language of discourse that enables them to feel not insulted by you, but actually some deep down common wish that's built around dilemmas, contradictions, ironies, paradoxes about what democracy really means and what an attack on democracy might be experienced by an individual.
Does anyone want to give a quick response?
Sure. Yeah, I think this is the central problem I've been trying to grapple with over the course of this talk and maybe the past 10 years, right? Is that everybody uses the language of democracy and many people sincerely believe it. When I said dishonesty, I didn't mean dishonesty on the part of the voters, right? I think voters believe, right? If you talk to, or let me back up. One of the most insulting articles I've ever read by an academic was about Trump voters in 2020. And the academic was not saying that they were racist. I don't actually think that that's insulting. I think it's just a negative spin on their cultural grievances. I think that what was insulting was that this person argued that they didn't believe the 2020 election was stolen. Yes, they did. They did believe the 2020 election was stolen. It was really important to them that that was believed to be true. And taking that grievance sincerely, even though it's totally fabricated, right? There's no reason to believe the 2020 US election was stolen, but that didn't make their belief any less sincere. And that belief comes from a place, right? A sense of distrust, first of all, hatred for the political opposition, and distrust in the system altogether, right? A sense that they don't see election results, they don't see them being tallied. How do they know that they're being tallied fairly? How do they know that the person that they trust, the person they feel like speaks to their grievances, Donald Trump, isn't the guy who's telling the truth about these things? And I think you have to take people seriously in their beliefs, even if you believe those beliefs are wrong, and there's objective evidence that those beliefs are wrong. I think that's the political philosopher John Rawls would call this a duty of civility, right? It's not that you have to be nice to everybody at all times, but you have to interact with people, engage with them as if their stated beliefs are in fact their true beliefs. And while politicians may be dishonest, ordinary citizens mostly are not in their beliefs. They might be confused, but not dishonest. And part of political persuasion, part of effective communication, means taking them at their word and trying to talk to them as if they are fellow citizens that you owe a moral responsibility to engage with in good faith.
Just to say that being part of the democratic camp means respecting those who voted for Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, those who voted for Donald Trump in the US, those who voted for Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, etc., etc. But I agree. I mean, we have come to understand that one of the first things, the first thing to disappear when a society falls under authoritarian rule is truth. So it's, very difficult to believe, of course, that those populists in power are defending democracy or defending democratic values. So that's why fighting for truth is so important. But authoritarians will always try to control the narrative. It's one of the first tools of the authoritarian playbook.
It's, I know that that tactic is very much in play from the political level. Like, sure, we're doing what we're doing in the name of democracy. I read this somewhere, and I can never recreate who wrote it, but that illiberal populist leaders love to build bridges and tunnels and big roads because it shows results that everybody can see, and they can argue why they need to have very few constraints on their power to just do things and get things done, and argue against all those procedures and laws. I mean, sure, they can say this is democracy I'm delivering, but ultimately there has to be a shared world of meaning, right? People have to know what democracy is, whether it's having promises you can fulfill, whether it's about the little guy feeling represented, or whether it's about understanding the nature of judicial review. Whatever it is, there has to be a shared world of meaning. And when there's not, anybody can come in and redefine it wrongly and in a manipulative way. And I think that needs to be out there. So how do you do that? I mean, that's a very long-term process. You have to educate for democracy. You have to build a political culture that really internalizes some of the less sexy and more technocratic elements of democracy and what it means and why those, annoying laws and procedures that take a lot of time are really important so that there's not an abuse of power. But unless you spend years inculcating that in people, hopefully from age 0, through the education system, then you don't have a shared world of meaning. And then anybody can come along and say, hi, this is my version of democracy.
Well, we certainly have a lot of work to do. Thank you so much for joining us at Perry World House. Please come again soon, and please join me in thanking our panelists for this great conversation.